Hello, lords and ladies. Today we're looking at aggression and appeasement. So basically we're looking at what it is that's going to lead to World War II breaking out. To do that, we have a couple of different objectives, 3 of them. We have to, by the end of this discussion, be able to explain why the Allied powers adopted a policy of appeasement before World War II. So why did the Allies appease Germany, Italy, and Japan before the war? The other is analyze the effects of Axis aggression on the League of Nations. So what does their aggressive behavior really reveal to us or show us about the League of Nations, and what effect will that have on its future? And also you're going to have to be able to evaluate the extent to which Guernica was a preview of events to come. So basically you'll need to know what happened at Guernica. It is during the Spanish Civil War, and what and how it relates to the rise of the dictators in the meantime. So these are the objectives, these are the things that you need to be able to do before we're done, and be able to explain and talk about and make a judgment about. So if you need to pause it, you might want to pause it now, and then we'll move on. So to begin, what we're going to want to do is really set up what appeasement is. You have to understand what it means to appease someone. So you might have used this word before, you might have not have, but if you're appeasing someone, it means you're giving in to them to keep them happy. So appeasement as a policy is to give in to the demands of an aggressor in order to keep the peace. So you're giving in to an aggressive country to try to avoid war and to try to keep the peace. The people who are going to adopt this policy, the people who practice appeasement, are the British, the French, and the United States. So essentially the Allied powers. And they do this prior to World War II breaking out, so throughout the 1930s. The reason that this is going to happen, think about what we've talked about with both Mussolini and Hitler. They are both fascists. Fascists state that peace is absurd. They put it out there very openly that peace is not something that they're interested in. So we know that there's going to be some kind of conflict that comes because of these people. So in order to avoid a full-scale war, and as much full-scale war as they can, the Allies decide that they're going to give in to his demands in order to keep the peace. So let's just kind of take a really simple example of what it means to appease someone. So take a look at this interesting picture here. When you have a baby, and the baby is screaming and crying, notice Mr. Bush there is not really interested in handling with his baby anymore. He wants him to be quiet. So typically what parents do to make the baby be quiet is give them what they need, which is, in this case, a pacifier. But as soon as that pacifier falls out, oh no, here comes screaming, crying, grumpy baby again, and they just want more, more, more. That's the idea I want you guys to think about. When you think about why is there a problem with appeasement, think about that fact, that that baby just learned that they just have to scream to get what they want. Kind of the same thing with the Axis powers, which are going to be Italy, Germany, and Japan in World War II. So if it's not going to work very well, why do the Allies do it? First of all, we have to remember that hindsight is 20/20. We don't understand very often what things are going to mean in the future. We care about what the issue is now. So the issues at this point and why they adopt this policy is because they felt legitimately, particularly Britain, that the Treaty of Versailles was too hard on Germany, that it cut their army down, they couldn't legitimately defend themselves, and that it didn't necessarily need to be that harsh. So that's one reason, the British guilt over the Treaty of Versailles. France and Britain, they both did not think Hitler was the biggest threat. They thought that Stalin was the biggest threat. He was a much bigger threat than Hitler. So when you look at those two combined, the British really look at that treaty as, we humiliated Germany and it was too much. We're going to need to let them kind of rebuild themselves, and we're going to see what effect that has. And they also thought, besides, Hitler's not our real enemy. Stalin is our biggest enemy. And so they feared the communist Stalin dictatorship more than they did the Hitler. Then you're hit with the Great Depression, and your economy goes further down than it already was. And so you've got to recover from that. There also is the element of this sincere belief in pacifism, that we are opposed to war. We do not want to fight again. That World War I, these are the men in power now who fought that war, and they don't want to see the same thing happen to their sons. And so anything to avoid war they feel is the best policy. The U.S., meanwhile, is staying out of everything. They're an isolationist country, so they just don't want to get involved. And so they don't disagree with appeasement. So here you have a cartoon, the German in the corner, kind of humiliated, with the peace treaty laying next to him. I seem to hear a child weeping, right? The idea that that treaty was too harsh. Stalin is the bigger threat. Communists are the bigger threat. I mean, that's inherent. That's rampant. That's something that both Britain and France thought. And they sincerely just wanted peace. They wanted to have calm, no war. They had seen enough of it already. And so now, when we start to see the early acts of aggression that these countries are going to engage in, we start to understand why there's not an immediate reaction. So the earliest act of aggression is probably, or for Japan anyway, is probably when it takes over China, starting in 1931, really. And when the Japanese invade China again in 1937, the League of Nations goes and says, you cannot do this. The rape of Nanking, we've talked about that. So many atrocities committed against the Chinese people that the League of Nations tells Japan, you cannot do this. And Japan, instead of bowing to that pressure from the League of Nations, simply withdrew from the League of Nations and said, that's it, we don't need to be a part of this organization. So, and then they marched triumphantly into China and took it over. So you see, that's the earliest and most profound act by the Japanese in terms of this. With the Italians in the Axis powers, the Italians in 1936 went into Ethiopia and they took over. Ethiopia, if you remember, had been the only African country besides Liberia to maintain its independence through the age of imperialism. So Italy went in there and tried to take over. When they did so, the Ethiopian president, or king, Haile Selassie, goes to the United Nations and says, please, you need to help us. We really need your assistance. We can't just be falling to these people, but we can't defend ourselves. They have better weapons than we do. Please help. So the League of Nations decides we're going to help you by voting sanctions, and sanctions means penalties, typically economic penalties, against Italy so that Italy can't buy things. But remember, they're trying to become self-sufficient, so this is not at first going to have much effect on Italy. And that's going to show that their disregard for the League of Nations, after what Japan has done now with the League of Nations, is going to show that the League of Nations is very, very weak and quite possibly not an interesting or a strong enough organization. So when we look, here's Ethiopia, and you see that the capital city there, Addis Ababa. When we look at the headlines, war, 2 towns in Ethiopia are bombed, Italian planes spread death in a sudden attack, right? This comes from, that's 3 cents too, by the way, but that comes from an American paper. Here's a protest that was going on actually in Great Britain. We protest murders by fascist troops in Addis Ababa. So you had a lot of people who wanted this to end, but when Ethiopia appealed to the League, as you see, the League did nothing. Nothing. Okay? And so there's Haile Selassie pleading with the League of Nations, please help my country, please, we cannot do this alone. And the League of Nations does nothing to stop Italy. On top of that, you have his fascist counterpart, Hitler, in Germany. He is breaking the Versailles Treaty. Now, typically when a country breaks a treaty, there are some repercussions from that. There's punishments or some kind of consequence from that breaking of the treaty. The treaty is a binding legal document. He has none of that. Okay, he starts building up his military again, tanks, putting more men than 100,000 into his army, because remember the treaty said, the treaty left Germany with 100,000 men in the army, 6 destroyers in its navy, and no air force. So it was decimated. Hitler starts rebuilding it, building tanks, planes, all the materials of war, untersea boats, U-boats, meaning submarines, which had been forbidden after World War I. So the Allies do absolutely nothing to stop this. They talk a good game, they criticize him and say that he's breaking the treaty, but no real consequences come from it. In 1936, he sends troops into the Rhineland. That's the area between Germany and France that they said that Germany could not, in the Treaty of Versailles again, that Germany could not put any kind of troops or weapons there, but the French could. And so when he remilitarizes, I should say, that Rhineland, nobody does anything. And the French are screaming. The French are angry about this, but they themselves don't really do anything other than complain about it. So here you can see Hitler's building up his troops to massive amounts of people. And then in the next photo, you will also see another element of his rebuilding, right? He's marching the troops through the streets. So he's showing pretty regularly excessive amounts of his military being built up. The next event that's going to be kind of a wake-up call for the rest of the world and kind of make them see that Hitler is definitely serious is the Spanish Civil War. What happens? Well, this is complicated, so you have to kind of follow along with it. Spain had a civil war, and there was a king in Spain who was being opposed by a fascist leader called Francisco Franco. Franco is leading a nationalist rebellion in the country. Now, he appeals to Hitler and Mussolini for assistance because he is a fellow fascist. And so Hitler and Mussolini send troops, and they send supplies, and they send all these things to Franco to try and help him take control and win that Spanish Civil War. One other thing that Hitler and Mussolini do in this time frame, though, and it is particularly Hitler engaging in this act, but there is a tiny little market town in northern Spain called Guernica, and it is small, quaint, you have an open-air market in the center of town, and it's a quiet place. So Germany flew planes over it. They attacked the town in 1937, and what they said was that they were trying to knock out a strategic bridge that was in the area, yet not one single shot hit the bridge. And a bridge is pretty large, so they were really testing out their weapons. And in 1939, Franco is going to win and set up a dictatorship in Spain. Here you can see a German plane preparing to drop on Guernica. And you're going to see a couple of photos of the aftermath of Guernica. So when you guys are looking at this, all of these acts of aggression, building up the military for Germany, breaking the Treaty of Versailles, going into Guernica and testing out your weapons on innocent civilians, okay, remilitarizing the Rhineland, all of these things are against the Treaty of Versailles, and each one is appeased. No country does anything about it. Same thing with Italy going into Ethiopia. Same thing with Japan going into China. They are allowed to do this. They are allowed to be aggressive, and no League of Nations force, no other countries' forces stand up and stop them. So we're starting on the path where we are seeing that Hitler, like we said with the baby, if you keep giving in, the baby just wants more and cries louder, right? And so that's what we're going to see with Hitler. He is just going to want more. And we'll leave it there for now.